Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing, Melissa?
I'm really well, thank you. It's a gorgeous summer's day, so absolutely fine. So how's everything going? You've recently put out a new video and you have a new Earth grid theory, which I know you've been working on for ages, and you've put it all out and I think you finished it pretty much, although I'm sure you'll be adding to it. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, I've spent a good few years looking at this. Really, really being inspired by the work of people like John Michell and Howard Crowhurst and the Heath brothers and others as well, like Livius Tacchini. There's other
Yeah.
people I've probably forgotten to mention as well, but I'm kind of building on the work of others, and I think that there's at least definitive, almost proof mathematically that there is a design intent in the placement of ancient sites around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are different ways into this whole idea that maybe things would have been located in particular sites. But your Earth grid theory is really interesting because it's quite unique and it's really interesting, really intriguing. So, for those who are unfamiliar with your work, can you briefly summarize what this Earth grid theory is about?
Okay, basically, if you look into the work of Stachini and Crowhurst and Michelle, etc., they've basically noted that there are sites north to south at sevenths between the equator and the North Pole. And I've started to look into this myself, and the further I've looked into it, I found other sites. It turns out other people already knew about these sites as well, but I found other sites, and it gets more comprehensive. And then when you start to look into the work of Stachini, he's noticing that there are places at half intervals between the equator and the North Pole. So instead of sevenths, it looks like it could be 14ths. And then obviously the world is a sphere. So if you continue that system of 14ths around the entire circumference of the planet, that then becomes 56. But then you start to notice there are also sites east to west that are at 56ths, but not in the same sort of consistency as the north to south ones. They seem to be referenced to like 4 or 5 major meridians that are separated by angular distances of radians, which is a kind of universal way of measuring angles.
So, you're looking at the whole world as a globe.
Yes.
And you're looking at the placement of some of these, so mostly sacred sites, but also natural sites, and how they relate to each other, and there's a system.
Yeah, definitely. There seems to be a system, and it seems to be based on, like you said, some of the most sort of important and largest of certain kinds of natural sites around the world. So natural ring structures like the Ricat structure and Lake Manicouagan. As far as I can tell, those are the 2 largest ring-shaped structures on the planet. And there's also some very important lakes, like the biggest lake in Southeast Asia and, Lake Geneva. They all seem to be very, very large lakes, Lake Van. They all seem to fit into this grid system. And it seems like somebody a long time ago noticed there was a mathematical relationship between these sites and decided to use those as a reference system to build other sites on a global grid.
So that already is quite surprising because I assumed when I first heard you were working on this map and that you were going to be looking at just man-made structures, so basically different kinds of temples and things. But actually, you're suggesting that natural features, especially lakes, are part of this, and maybe were the foundation for the system.
Yes, these sites seem to be very large, and I would put this down to being able to resolve errors in sort of using very primitive archaeological astronomical tools. So if you were using a spear or a sundial to try and calculate, your latitude and longitude, there might be significant error. So if you have something like a large lake or something large like the Ricat structure or Lake Manicouagan, it's going to be difficult to miss these places. So if you're out by a little bit, then you can find out where you are. Because if you're talking about a world that might be more densely forested, it might be difficult to find your way. If you've got like a 0.1 degree or even a 0.05 degree error in your measurement, you might be really close to where you want to be, but you might struggle to find your way.
So this is a practical purpose then. So you're suggesting that from a navigation point of view, perhaps even from an engineering point of view, because I know you're an engineer, that this actually serves a purpose.
I think it serves a purpose, but I also think it's also a system that it's going to be almost impossible to erase. I mean, you're not going to be able to erase the Ricat structure or Lake Manicouagan. I mean, obviously lakes can dry up. I think there's a lake in the Rub Kali that was part of this reference system, which is now dry. It's now just desert there. But I think part of it is to preserve it. So if you've got these natural systems, I think there's one site in particular that's been designed to be the origin point of this system, and I think that's Tiwanaku.
Okay, so that's our first man-made site. It is a man-made site, isn't it? Unless there are some natural features near it, but otherwise it's in Bolivia. Is it Bolivia?
Bolivia. I think it's only just in Bolivia. I think it's very close to the border.
And so how then does that fit in with these two natural features that you've just mentioned? So Lake Manicouagan and the Ricat structure.
So Lake Manicouagan, as far as I can tell, it's the largest ring-shaped structure on the planet, or at least one that's visible to the eye. And it's a perfect ring today because it's been sort of modified by the Canadian government to be a massive reservoir. But before that, it used to be two crescent-shaped lakes. But you could still tell exactly what shape it was. But it's an impact crater. I think it's about 200 million years old. But so you have the largest ring-shaped structure in the world, which is this Canadian lake, and then to the east in Africa you have the Ricat structure, which is in West Africa in Mauritania, and just as fate would have it, it's precisely 1 radian to the east of Lake Manicouagan, which is one heck of a coincidence. And obviously that's something else that could be discussed in a different show about what you think is the nature of reality, but we won't go there for now.
There's room for everything here. So a radian, so we have to have a little bit of basic geometry for this. This is to do with the geometry of the circle, right?
That's right. Yeah, there are people that would make a very good case that all units of angular measurement throughout history are arbitrary. I'd say when you look into it a bit more, I'd say they aren't arbitrary, but you could say they were arbitrary. And if you didn't fully understand their origins, they pretty much are arbitrary units of measurement. Whereas the radian is a universal system for measuring the angle, the angles or arc distances on a circle. So instead of, say, a 360-degree circle, you quantify the circumference of the circle in terms of its own radius. So a circle will have 2 pi radians that make up its entire circumference, and that will always be true regardless of where you are in the universe or where you are throughout time, and regardless of the size of the circle. So it's a self-referencing system.
So when you say, I'm sorry.
Sorry, just say it's just a bit crazy that the 2 largest ring-shaped structures on the planet are separated by precisely 1 radian, and it's the radian as calculated by using 22/7 for the value of pi, and there's basically no error, no discernible error in the placement of these natural features.
So just to explain, you're talking about a particular segment of the Earth's circumference, which is relatable to the Earth's radius, and which links these sites. Okay, so that could be a nice natural coincidence, but what made you think that it wasn't?
Well, I think that the placement. Well, I think that the obviously these places are natural sites. So there's going to be two ways to look at this. You could say it is a coincidence that these 2 natural features are 1 radian apart. Obviously, they were closer at one point in time because the continents have drifted over the last 200 million years. But you could say, because there do seem to be patterns in the placements of lakes and other mountains and large features, there could be something about the nature of reality that means features are always going to form in certain places over time. That's really getting into, I guess, like metaphysics. But if we go back to Tiwanaku is precisely on the same longitude as Lake Manicouagan.
Okay.
And it happens to be equidistant from both the Ricat structure and Lake Manicouagan. So it's 67.5 degrees, which is 3/16 of the Earth's circumference.
That's very interesting already. So that would be already an interesting explanation for why Tiwanaku was where it is. However, there's obviously, as you said, navigation problems, and like how do you figure this out? Because we're talking very, very long distances here. So maybe this is something you can come back to later. But then what happens after Tiwanaku in your grid system? So are there any sites then that immediately can be linked to this triplet?
Well, I think if you start to look at the sort of grid as a whole, you can sort of mark out, you can find the major markers for these meridians. So to the east of the Ricat structure, the next major meridian, which is 1 radian to the east, not quite the same level of precision, you have the ziggurat of Ur. Okay. So, and then to the east of that one, you have to the east of the ziggurat of you have Ak Yum at the Angkor complex in Cambodia. Okay. So that seems to be another major meridian. And then it looks like Uluru in Australia is the next major meridian. But because of the spacings of the continents, they couldn't use a radian reference. So what it looks like people have done is they chose a place that was 1 radian minus exactly 30 degrees. So instead of 57 X degrees, it's 27. They've taken 30 away from it. And then Uluru seems to fit onto this grid. But in terms of Tiwanaku, are you referencing like it's the Michell line to Avebury, for example?
Oh, right. So John Michell, so the 60s and 70s writers wrote that Avebury was at a particular point on the meridian between the North Pole and the equator. Isn't that right?
That's right. Yeah, Avebury. If you were looking at the explanation of sevenths between the equator and the North Pole, Avebury, discovered by John Michell, is 4/7 between the equator and the North Pole, and it's exactly 4/7. There's no error. Avebury is very precisely placed, and again, Avebury is 1/6 of a radian east of the Ricat structure precisely as well. So it's using an interesting system. But Avebury is also is halfway between the Angkor complex and Tiwanaku. They're both separated from Avebury by 89 degrees, which is really the limit of solar alignments, because I think these sites are all set out using solar alignments, basically.
So this is already turning into something very complicated. So we have lines of meridian, so the ones that go north to south, and we have lines of latitude, so the ones that are about how much daylight you have and how much heat you might have, according to where you are in your latitude. So this is already quite complicated. And then you also have this mix of man-made features, so temples and other structures, and then you have these natural structures. So you mentioned Ayers Rock, you said Uluru, and that's maybe also interesting in that it's that mix of natural features with these man-made features.
Mm. Yeah, I think well, my idea is that this all goes back to a time so far back in prehistory that people probably started navigating using these features before they even started to build anything. And then I think after that, they started to build mounds. So I think there was a mound building culture. And I think where you get places like Tiwanaku, Avebury, and Giza, for example, you get. I think there were mounds at these sites originally. I think a lot of them have been built over with complex temples and sacred monuments, and I think that began in the Neolithic and continued into the Bronze Age.
Yeah, that seems quite likely to me, that a site which has been sacred for a very, very long time should still be sacred in one form or another. Perhaps a cathedral on a site where there was once a megalithic structure, who knows. Do you want to share an image perhaps of your grid, of your map?
Yeah, no problem. If I can
If you
figure
have
out how
one.
to do it. Oh, okay. Present.
Because
There it is.
the reason that sites are sacred is a really interesting question. Why are they where they are, and what are they connected to? So this grid is very interesting from that point of view as well, even though it's not just about sacred sites. But it's interesting to see that many of the sites that you have identified and put on your grid are in many ways important in some kind of religious tradition or other.
Okay. Is it sharing with you yet?
I can't see it yet, Matt.
This is when you can tell you're getting old. When you can't
Coming up now. Got it. Here we go.
There we
So
go.
far away.
Okay. So you've basically got all the lines I've marked out in yellow, which are sort of fundamental to the entire grid system. So if we start with latitude, we have the equator, the Tropic of Cancer, and the Tropic of Capricorn. And I've marked those at 22.1 degrees instead of the present day 23.44. And that's because there's a 41,000 year cycle where the tropics move. And they will, over that cycle, they'll move between 22.1 and 24.5 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many of these alignments, or probably all of these alignments, were, I say alignment, I haven't drawn any of the alignments on here. This is just the grid system.
Mm-hmm.
But these grid points are used to create ley lines over very long distances. Like we spoke about Tiwanaku in Bolivia being linked by basically a solar ley line to Avebury. So you have to have sites within the tropics to make this happen, because you have what I'm calling zenith alignments. You have to wait until the sun is directly overhead somewhere in the tropics. And at that point, you can then mark out these alignments over very long distances. And we could talk about that in more detail later.
Mm-hmm. So can I just ask you, you've selected a particular value for the obliquity of the Earth, and so therefore a particular date, or roughly, what epoch are we looking at here for the tropics?
I don't know. I've not looked into that accurately, to be honest, because I think this might go back a number of cycles. So
okay. Okay, so it's not just within the last 41,000 years. It could be beyond that.
But it could be way beyond that. But the reason I'm choosing this is because if you put your site outside of the tropics or outside of 22.1 degrees, but within 24.5, that site, you won't always be able to use it throughout time to create these alignments because the sun won't be directly overhead. And I think there is, I think if you go to Ujjain, this sacred lingam site in India,
mm-hmm.
I think there's a story there about the placement of Ujjain that sort of might explain that maybe someone made a mistake and they placed it outside of 22.1 degrees, because you can use Ujjain today to create long distance alignments, but at some point you're not going to be able to use it for a few thousand years.
Slight hiccup. So Ujjain, is a site in India. It's associated with a festival, the Kumbh Mela festival. Why do you think it's associated with these alignments, or it's connected to the grid?
Basically, many of these sites are home to omphalos stones.
Mm-hmm.
And omphalos stones, basically, an omphalos basically means navel or womb. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these sites, if you look at the traditions behind them, it's always said that this site is the center of the world. And I think these omphalos stones are representative of a astronomical device used to create solar alignment. So it's not overly complicated. I can explain that a bit later. But basically, I think these sites have these navel stones to commemorate that they were once part of this grid system. Even there's no omphalos stone at Tiwanaku, but Tiwanaku used to be called the stone at the center. One of the old sort of native names that was used before, it was called Tiwanaku.
So there could have been a stone there originally.
It could be, yeah. I suspect that many of these stones would have been destroyed or moved, or there was a kind of omphalos shaped It's almost phallic-shaped stone at Avebury that went missing a couple of 100 years ago. If you go
I
to,
suppose all of these sites are often, I was going to say desecrated, but just, they're just forgotten about, and then the stones are reused.
Yeah. I think some of it's intentional, some of it's unintentional. Probably I don't want to go off on a political tangent at the moment, but I do think that at some point in the past, people were destroying these places so they could create a new religion and erase knowledge from the people, the lower caste of people, wherever you may be in the world.
And so, what other sites then have you? What in the story of how you managed to build this map up? What was the next site then that you looked at, or how did it come together?
Basically, I started a spreadsheet where I was putting in latitudes and longitudes of sites, and I was trying to see if there's any relationship between sites. So I'd take a place like Lake Titicaca, for example, and Tiwanaku, and I'd say, what's the difference east to west between this site and that site? And I noticed that the Rickard structure was 1 radian to the east. I thought that was a bit odd, and I like to go into Google Earth and put just lines of longitude in north to south, and I was like, oh wow, that goes straight through Lake Manicouagan. So I thought, well, I better start looking for other places that are on a radian system, and the Ziggurat of Ur came up, and the Angkor complex turned up as well. Uluru turned up with some help from Dane Quirk, Saturn Rooster on YouTube. So I thought, oh, there's something going on east to west. So I thought, well, there's this system of sevenths, north to south, and then you start to look into Stakini, and it looks like it's actually twice the resolution, north to south. So I plot a bunch of these sites, but then I think, well, there's this. If you look north to south and it's a system of 56, does this apply east to west? And you start to look at sites east to west, and you say, wow, they're separated by 156 east to west. But you notice then that they are actually referenced to these major radian meridians. And you think, oh, I really am onto something now, because it's not a consistent 56 east to west. There's like a small section, maybe 6 or 7 sites that are referenced to one major meridian, and so on and so forth. It's also the accuracy of the placement of some of these sites. So if you look at Gore, just east of the sort of Arabian Peninsula, that is precisely on the grid. Again, the line of longitude goes straight through the middle of that site, and it's a circular city.
Okay. So this number 56, I know you've made a video on this grid, and I know you mentioned the number 56 in it as a key number in terms of dividing up the circumference of the Earth with the various lines of longitude and latitude. So how does this work then in terms of the Earth, this number 56?
Well, I think it's all related to pi and radians again. So obviously you have the major radians, which are very obviously, there's no interpretation required. These major meridians are separated by radians. But if you multiply 56 by pi, you get 176. And it's a very nice number to work with if you divide it by radians, because if you have 176 segments around a circle, each radian is exactly 28 segments. So you couldn't do that with the number 56. I think you get clues as to what's going on when you start to look at the Great Pyramid in Giza, and at Stonehenge, and even Borobudur.
Okay. And there are a good few sites, when you take a step back from the map, sort of concentrated in a band in the northern hemisphere just above the tropics. That's interesting in itself, isn't it? That these sites, just taking a step back, seem to correspond to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the Far East, and also then the east coast of what's now Canada and the United States. So why do you think that is?
I think there's a bias in the Northern Hemisphere because it's much easier to create long-distance alignments. I think there's just too much ocean in the Southern Hemisphere,
Hmm.
and it's much more difficult to create these alignments.
Yeah. So there's that sense of a practical purpose, a sense of like how. So how do you think this is created then? So if you want to go from one point to the next, or from one line of longitude to the next, how does it work?
So if we start with latitude, because that's probably the easiest one to do, I think people were. Well, I think there would have been a range of skills amongst people. Some people might be very good at this, and some people might find it a bit more difficult. But wherever you are in the world, you can measure your latitude using a spear, so long as you do it on the equinoxes, the spring and autumn equinoxes, when the length of day is and night is equal, because the sun is directly over the equator. And I'll try. I've got another drawing somewhere I can probably share with you. There we go. So basically, if anywhere on the world, if you have a spear or a gnomon, which is like the sort of point on a sundial or an obelisk, if you know the height of the obelisk and you measure the length of the shadow at high noon on the equinoxes, you can find out your distance or angle from the equator or from the nearest pole. So the angle towards the top of the gnomon is your distance or latitude from the equator, and your angular difference from your nearest pole is the sort of bottom angle towards the tip of the shadow. And so if you have, you can create a compensation tool to actually do this on any day of the year, but you can do this on the equinoxes without, much compensation at all. But if you imagine the sun moves over or moves throughout the tropics in a sinusoidal pattern, a sinusoidal pattern is basically based around the movement of a circle. So if you were to stick a pen on the edge of a wheel and run it against the wall, you would get a perfect sine wave on the wall. So that would tell us
so you basically you're converting a circle into a graph form that goes up and down like this.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And if you actually just take a circle and take a quarter circle and divide it into 91, I say 91 because it's basically as far as integers are concerned, there's 91 days for each season.
Mm-hmm.
Over those 91 days, you can move through this quarter circle. And then if you I don't have a picture of it right now. I think I sent you a picture of it once. I'm not sure where it is on my computer at the moment. But if you have a quarter circle, and to one side of the quarter circle you have, say, 22.1 degrees. If you're in that epoch, each day you count up the quarter circle, you can draw a line straight across to this sort of 22.1 degree reference system, and it'll tell you how many degrees you need to add or subtract to your latitude measurements that you've taken with your spear or gnomon.
Yes.
So that's how you can measure your latitude. Longitude, I think the major meridian longitudes were calculated by analyzing the movements of the moon. So there's a number of different ways you can actually do this. And somebody actually figured this out, I think, back in the 1400s. But basically, the moon moves around the Earth something like half a degree per hour. And if you reference a fixed star and you know the speed that the moon is moving, you can actually calculate longitude. And if you know how to compensate for the tilt of the moon, you can actually do it quite accurately.
Okay, that's interesting. So it is possible. So that clock, that famous Harrison's chronometer, it was pointless?
I wouldn't say pointless, but I think he didn't actually win the prize, did he, when he invented the chronometer? Because they said,
he got the money anyway. I think there was a sad story at the end, but yeah.
I think didn't they say something like, well, you still need to make astronomical observations to actually be able to calculate your longitude?
That rings a bell. Yeah, I think they got out
Something
of
like
having
that.
to hand out the money somehow.
Because
So,
you can mechanically measure longitude using a gyroscopic compass. People, back at the time of Harrison, they wouldn't have had that sort of precision, but you could suspend something in an oil, and you can have like a gyroscope that can tell you your longitude without actually having to make any observations of the stars or the sun or the sky at all.
yeah.
It's
Just
a bit
to
cool,
interrupt, there's
really.
an interesting comment there from Marshall. She says that there's a theory that she has about latitude and longitude being woven into tartan, which is interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's stories. Stories from basically from lots of different cultures where you see certain numbers turn up in their mythologies or in their artwork, and I think some of that might be encoding some of this interest, some of these key numbers and concepts into them. So it's things like that. Just they're not surprising, but they're definitely interesting, and they should be followed up, really, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, actually. Yeah. So what's the next step in understanding the grid then, Matt?
Let me just bring the grid back up. That's the complete grid. Okay. So yeah, we've talked about the tropics and the equator, and we've talked about the major meridians. But I think you also have, if you look at the extreme level of accuracy in some of the placements of these sites, I'd say the black lines, they're sort of east to west black lines, the 56th separations, I think they are placed using land surveys because they are so accurate. And I think people, if they understood geometry, they would have known, or they would have been able to calculate the circumference of each line of latitude, and then they could, like a bemetist would have done in ancient Greece or Egypt, they could have measured paces or used some sort of geared tool to actually measure distances east to west. And there's a particular latitude that's very useful, which is the Delphi latitude, which is this one here, because if you have a circle that's divided into 56, that latitude is, well, regardless of how many divisions it is, that latitude is equal to the quarter circle.
Okay, so the number 56 is connected to the radian and to pi, especially as 22/7. And actually, Dane is just asking there about 176. So that's also a key number.
It is, yeah.
And it's a number we get from John Michell and John Michell as well, especially as a ratio, 176.
I didn't know about John Michell and John Michell. I mean, do you want to explain that? Because I'd be quite interested to know.
It's a ratio in metrology. So he has 441/440, 176 over 175, and this is part of his system. Basically, John Michell has a system whereby most units of measure come in packets of 6.
Okay.
And he has terms for the more root, geographic, etc., and they're related then by these ratios in different combinations: 441/440, 176 over 175. But in your grid, how does 176 work?
Okay, I think it's really just referenced from 56 to pi. So you can, if we talk about the Great Pyramid at Giza, I think if you look at the Great Pyramid, if you look at the dimensions, I think it's trying to tell you a number of different things under different disciplines. But as far as this world grid is concerned, we could say the Great Pyramid has a circumference of 1,760 Royal Egyptian cubits, and that's based on the numbers of Flinders Petrie, and I think that's still widely accepted today. And if you divide that by 10, you get 176, and for the purposes of this grid, we could say that, you know, the 1760 is for scale, but it's really supposed to be telling us 176.
Okay.
But if you look into Dane's work, and you should definitely have Dane on the show.
Yeah, I will, hopefully. Dane, everybody, Dane, that's Saturn Rooster there in the comments, and he has an amazing YouTube channel. Sorry, Matt.
He's really been looking into, you know, how these numbers might, you know, play out to other things. And it looks like, you know, the circumference of the diameter of the Earth in miles is divided by, you can divide it by 176, you can divide it by 360, you can divide it by these other sort of key numbers, and you always end up with integers. And some of the integers that they come out with are quite interesting as well. But I think, you know, the 176 is sort of referenced to pi. It's some sort of multiplier, but I think it's also to do with radians, because if you look at that original terminology sort of by Michell and, you know, and his cohort, it's sevenths between the equator and the North Pole, and not 14ths. And that might be, sevenths might be another useful way to look at things then, because you can, you know, divide, if you divide everything by 2 pi, so if you divide 176 by 2 pi, you'll get, let me just double check this, make sure I'm not making this up. Yeah, you get 28. So it could be that it's to do with the maths, you know, it could be to do with the maths that they're using to divide the world in. They want to have nice ratios like 2 pi, which is, you know, part of their radian system, etc.
Yeah. So 28 is an interesting number to divide things into. There's the reference to the lunar month, which can be expressed as 28 days. And then, of course, an Egyptian world cubit is divided into 28 smaller parts, so the little digits. And of course, it's 4 times 7, and there's the whole lunar connection, the week of 4 weeks of 7 days, making a month, etc., etc. So dividing things by 28 or by 7 would make total sense. It would fit with what is known about ancient history and about dividing just things up generally, let alone the globe. And also, as you mentioned earlier, I think you said about there are traditions of dividing up the Earth into 7 parts, 7 climates. Isn't that right?
Something like that. And I think these concepts can go back to, well, they were known about at least in the 1300s, because if you read Hugh Newman's Earth Grids book. Oh yeah,
I have it. I don't know where. It's so small. I always lose it.
I think I've got it on Kindle, so I can't lose it.
It's about this. It's about this.
But basically, with Hugh Newman's book, he says there's somebody in the 1300s called Ibn Khaldun who said the Earth is split into 7 latitudes, and it could be a reference to the actual northern hemisphere. You have the Voden tradition, where they say, you know, the Earth is made from 7,000 coils of the serpent, and the Voden sort of main temple site, Python's temple in Ouida, Benin, Africa.
I was hoping we wouldn't have to talk about snakes, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that is linked to Avebury geodetically. We can go through that in a minute, but that Python's temple is it's like the zenith point on this alignment between Avebury and the Ring of Brodgar, and just because it's going through Avebury, it's important to note, you know, Howard Crowhurst has spotted that Avebury and Silbury Hill are separated by exactly 1/7000th of the distance between the equator and the North Pole. And it's interesting that then the Python's temple, you know, is the sort of zenith origin point of this alignment system. And not only is Python's temple, you know, the zenith point, the actual temple itself is located 156th north of the equator. So you're getting to see this number. Number again.
You can see there's a pattern. So I had a quick look at this Python temple in Benin, and I was expecting it like a temple, you know, something with sculptures. and what I saw was a shack with loads of snakes in it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that's not to say, as you said, it's obviously a very important place going way back. You know, you said it's central to the religion, and absolutely it's ancient. But I was surprised, and apparently the snakes just kind of live in this room or this house, this structure, and then sometimes they go out and about for a bit. They might pop into someone's house, then come back again. So
yeah. I mean, there's a couple of sort of egg-shaped or spherical-shaped stones at the site. I don't know what they're for. I'm kind of thinking, are they referencing the Omphalos? But it's, the Python's temple is the main sort of sacred center of the Voden religion. Voden's it's a very new religion. I think it's about 500 or 600 years old, but its roots can be traced back maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years. So it wasn't really a religion before 600 years ago. I think really when sort of colonialists started coming to Africa, it sort of changed. You get the colonial mindset, and then what you're doing, which is quite informal, then becomes formal, because that's what the people that are coming across are bringing with them. And the sort of the people of Voden are happy to introduce other people into their beliefs, like Christ, for example. But if you look at the Python's temple, I mean, I found this place just by trying to find zenith nodes for my alignments, because I'm saying any ley line must have an origin point within the tropics. So
that's interesting. So these zenith nodes, this idea of the tropics that you've already mentioned, so they're really important. So this is all about the practicality you said about being able to measure the shadow of a gnomon or some kind of structure at noon, at the solstice. I'm sorry, at the equinox. So these zenith nodes are really key then, aren't they?
Yeah, and these particular nodes, you have to find the day of the year at which the sun is directly overhead, and often it's probably 2 days a year that any one site can be used as a zenith site. So when you get to the extremes of the tropics, it would, if you were at the part of time where it's the 22.1 degree cycle, you could probably use this, the summer solstice and the day either side of that to create the alignments. And places that are closer to the equator, there'll be one day where you can use it, and then you'll have to wait several months until the sun's come back down, from its extremity in the north or south to your site. But again, if you understand the sinusoidal pattern, you can actually use your compensation tool to know the exact day when these are, the sun is going to be overhead. But I would take this a step further, and I think Omphalos stones were basically I think the original Omphalos stones were actual globes that were used to create these alignments. Because obviously, if you create a miniature globe, the sun is going to interact with it in the same way that it interacts with our full-size globe. You just have to make sure that the equator and your site are inclined in such a way that it follows the same pattern as it does in the real world. So if you're at 30 degrees latitude, your Omphalos stone has to be tilted by 30 degrees, and then the site that you're at has to be at the dead top center of the Omphalos stone. And then you can actually...
The conical shape, is that how you'd explain it, of many of these stones?
I don't understand the conical shape. I don't know if it's trying to hide knowledge or if there was some practical purpose to it. I've only figured out how to get it to work with a hemisphere, with a perfectly spherical hemisphere. So I don't know about the sort of the conical shape. But if you look at lingams in India, some of those lingams are almost perfectly, not all of them, but some of them are almost perfectly hemispherical at the top.
Yeah, so that brings, I mean, that they possibly have a connection to, some kind of phallic symbol. So would they be also connected to, like, practically, like, trying to find your way around the globe? Are they compatible? Is it possible to have those two explanations?
I think, the idea that I'm going with is that either knowledge has been hidden or lost over time, and almost like Chinese whispers, people are like, oh, we used to be able to use these, certain shaped stones, or they might have said egg shaped, and then people start making them egg shaped, and somebody might have a different idea of what an egg is, because some animals lay spherical eggs and some animals lay ovoid eggs. And I think knowledge gets lost over time, and then you end up with stones that aren't necessarily the same shape that you think they should be. But it's interesting that many of these omphalos stones have like a grid pattern carved into them. So I think a lot of these omphalos stones were probably, the ones that have been found over the last few thousand years, I think they're more symbolic than practical, but they kind of, being placed at these sites, people know that these sites were really important for navigation at some point in the past, but maybe they haven't figured out how their ancestors did it because they're now agricultural people and they're settled, and they don't have the need to navigate over such long distances.
So that an old body of knowledge would somehow subsist in fragments but become sort of solidified, almost useless, just is like something that wouldn't be necessarily understood in terms of a practical system or dynamic system, but just inherited.
Yeah, I mean, if you gave me an abacus, I wouldn't know how to use an abacus, even though people weren't using them very long ago. I know what it does.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do I use it? Don't know.
No, that's a good example. I think a lot of people would be in the same boat. Although possibly not just a few decades ago. I think there's been a bit of a loss of knowledge that we've had just, in the last few generations. Actually, an interesting question there about the imperial system. So you've mentioned dividing up the globe very precisely and according to a particular mindset, if you like. I was going to say particular types of numbers, but a particular way of thinking about numbers and ratios. And then that would give us, so the modern meter in some ways, in one tradition, because we know that the quadrant, the polar quadrant is divided into 10,000 parts to give us a kilometer, no kilometer between the pole and the equator. And so the imperial system also is based on these divisions. It's slightly a different system, but do you think it's compatible? Yeah. Or either one is compatible with what you have here in terms of your grid?
Well, if you look at the 56th north to south or east to west, but only at the equator, because obviously they taper in towards each other because of the way that we project these lines. You have, well, if we look at 28th to start with, the original sort of proposal by, Michell et al., the distance then, north to south and at the equator, east to west, is 888 miles, which is a really, really simple number to remember. And obviously, if it's 56th you're looking at, then it's going to be 444 miles between each one of these sites. And again, if you look at Dane's work, you keep seeing these sort of triple numbers, which some people call angel numbers, turning up. Yeah. So definitely miles are being used. But as far as ley lines are concerned, you see a range of measurements being used. You see miles. There's some places that seem to be like lunar distances, in which is obviously 2,160 miles. There's alignments where places that either in nautical miles or stadia, and you see alignments that are definitely in kilometers. And some are even in inches as well, believe it or not. So it seems like a lot of these measurements go back a very, very long way, like deep into prehistory.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. And I would agree that they're all interrelated as well. And so it would make sense that possibly you might find some sort of echo of these systems in your grid. And there's a little comment there about the number 28 from Rare Gem, saying that it takes 28 Earth days for the sun to rotate on its axis at the equator.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's interesting.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, clearly the number 28 is important. It could be for very many different reasons. And also the number 7. I mean, we mentioned the moon, but of course it's the 7 traditional planets originally.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just ask you then about Avebury? So you've mentioned Avebury and you've mentioned Stonehenge. So these are part of a meridian. How would you explain that, or what do you think the purpose is? Because those two sites are quite close. They're only a few miles apart. So how does that work then in terms of the reason for building those sites so close to each other, but still on the same meridian? Is there? Do you think your grid might be able to help with that kind of question?
I think there's a whole bunch of reasons. I'm just going to open Google Earth up quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's reasons I'm going to completely miss as well. Things I haven't even thought of. But we'll go down to Python's temple and we'll draw an alignment. So if you see that where I've put Python's temple error, that's just where, if I was going to build Python's temple, I would have put it there, because it's like 7 kilometers off being perfectly 156th north of the equator. So like I said, I think there are errors in the placements of these sites. And perhaps as technology improves or changes, that you start to get a more accurate placement of places. Mm-hmm. Okay, the first thing to say is this site I've labeled as Dankoli. That is the most sacred shrine in the Voden religion. And it actually sets out the alignment to Avebury. And it's pretty much 100 nautical miles, and it might be there just to say, look, this is an important distance away, so take note, because it's important, and you might need to know where it points to. And this terminates, really, as far as I can tell, at the ring of Brodgar, which is just over here. You can tell I've done this a few times, can't you?
Yes.
So the ring of Brodgar is the 3rd largest stone circle in Britain. And you'll see it's not exactly perfect, but you've got Avebury and Stonehenge. If you get rid of the Python's temple, because it's such a long alignment, you will get small errors. But if you went straight down to Stonehenge, you get a better alignment. And if you ignore Python's temple, but again, it doesn't work because you need the zenith node for it to happen.
Yeah.
If we draw a line to Stonehenge to Avebury, we get basically what's 1/4 of a degree. We get exactly 1/4 of a degree. If I go dead center to center, actually, just to make, just to prove a point.
Yeah, that was that first observed by John Michell? Or
I don't know. I'm sure. When I found it, I thought, I bet you, like Howard and everyone else already knows about this. So probably John Michell.
This line is very interesting in and of itself, as it goes right through Britain in a sort of a vaguely north-south way. And David Kenworthy has called it the Eclipse line, and he's identified various sites along it that correspond to planets.
That doesn't surprise me at all. I think the purpose of Stonehenge is manifold, basically. If we look at it in terms of degrees quickly, it's exactly 1/4 of a degree, and that means it's 1,440th of the Earth's circumference. So 1440, 1/1440th of the Earth's circumference is the distance between Stonehenge and Avebury. And then it's interesting because the southern, you probably can't see it on this one. I'll change the clock on there so you can probably see it.
So on its own, this is an interesting coincidence, but together with all the rest of your finds, the fact that it's a particular division of the Earth's size is very interesting.
It is, and especially as it's 1/1440th, 1440. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. I don't know what the resolution's like, but there's like a...
Well, it's not bad.
There's an exit point at the bottom of Stonehenge, and that alignment takes you to Python's temple. It's almost like they're saying, yeah, that gap in the bank is where the zenith node is, down in Africa. And it's interesting because the circumference of the innermost bank is 560 Royal Egyptian cubits. What are Royal Egyptian cubits doing there? And if we use the same principle of divide it by 10, like at Giza, then it's that 56 number. Mm-hmm. And this Stonehenge, as we see it now, is a Bronze Age monument, but the original Neolithic form, it was just 56 posts, probably wooden posts. and they were pretty much equally spaced. It wasn't perfect, but to the sort of naked eye, it looks pretty good. So they're trying to tell you 56 is an important number at Stonehenge.
I think that Robin Heath explained that for him, this 56 number was about basically an analog computer for working out eclipses, because it was just the right number of poles.
It could well be as well, and there might have been a way they used that to actually measure longitude.
Actually, interesting. Sorry to interrupt.
I was just I was talking to Manu Saif-Zadeh the other day, and he was saying about I think it was during the time of Alexander the Great, people were using eclipses to measure longitude. So it might help to have a similar number system. And it's interesting then that Robin Heath is saying that 56 is exactly the right number.
Yes,
to do
because
that.
It's twice 28, and you can move, if you have these, basically like a circular abacus, a gigantic circular abacus, you can move a sort of a counter around one direction. I think he said 2 blocks at a time, and then the other counter going around in the other direction 1 block at a time, or something like that. And eventually it works as a sort of a clock.
Yeah, and I mean to the prehistoric layman that might be trying to navigate or figure his way around the world, if he's not an expert at metrology and navigation, he may have been told, if you look up at the sky at the same time of night, so choose a star, and it will tell you the angle at which the moon is at this time of of its 18.6 year cycle, and you just have to remember that the exact same time the next night, the moon has moved by 1/28th relative to that fixed star. So
yes, that's interesting. And of course, 144, as Marshall was pointing out, really interesting number as well.
Yeah. But yeah, this alignment goes up to the Ring of Brodgar, and basically, it runs right by Avebury.
Yeah.
And I think that might even explain why the blue stones and the Scottish stone are found at Stonehenge. I'll go into the blue stones in a minute, but there's one, I can't remember which stone it is at Stonehenge. Is it the altar stone or something that comes from Scotland?
I think so, yeah.
And
I think that was only discovered, or at least put out into the press a couple of months ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I think that might even be to tell people, you've got it's almost like they're trying to put lots of information in there. And we say that, I've said that sort of gap or causeway in the bank, that takes you to Python's temple, is pointing to it. But that stone, and if you're well traveled in the Stone Age and you're familiar with geology, which I guess, I think we can't underestimate what the way people might have noticed things. I mean, you notice it yourself when you go around the country or see a photograph of somewhere. You can say, oh, that's Wales, or that's yeah, well, that's Somerset, or you can tell from a photograph where
the color of the grass, even sometimes,
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree with that. Yeah. And so you've got this stone, which the geologists say could even be from Orkney, and it's like, well, it's pointing towards the third largest stone circle at Orkney. But if we go the other way, if I just use Stonehenge again, it's 56 degrees away from Serpent Mound, which is up here.
So we have more serpents. So you mentioned Python's temple. Now we have Serpent Mound, and sometimes you have a kind of a serpenty type shape around the sort of omphalos stones.
Exactly. Yeah. I think there's a whole bunch of symbology put into that, but I think one of the sort of roles of the serpent is to share knowledge, and I think that's why when you start, well, even before monotheism, you start in early civilizations, you start to see a demonization of the serpent. And for a civilization to exist, you need to have an underclass that doesn't have knowledge like the overclasses. It's like a demonizing of knowledge that takes place. Okay, so you see that alignment, it's 56 degrees. I mean, Google's saying it's 55.91. I'm going to call that 56 degrees.
Okay.
But it runs right by Stanton Drew.
Okay.
And why is that important? Well, it's the second largest stone circle in Britain. So you've got the second and third largest stones in Britain creating alignments for Stonehenge. And obviously Avebury is the largest in Britain. And that's part of the Orkney alignment as well, the Orkney to Python's temple.
This line is going to Serpent Mound in Ohio, is that right?
It is, yeah. So Stanton Drew, the line disappears when you zoom in, but you'll see I've kept my cursor where it is. So my cursor is where the line has just disappeared and Stanton Drew is up there. Yeah. It's you know, it's that close. And just to put things into perspective, there are 1,300, 1,300 known stone circles in Britain, and we know that other stone circles have been erased. Thomas Hardy's house was built on a sort of Stonehenge type site in Dorset.
I remember reading about that.
But the reason I think this is interesting again is because you've got the Orkney stones, or the Orkney stone rather, at Stonehenge. That's set up with the alignment, but then you look at where this points to Serpent Mound, and it's running very close to the Presley Hills in Wales, and they think the bluestones were erected there first. And it's like, well, it's almost, again, it's trying to tell you there's an important alignment. So it's like the ancient people were trying to reinforce these alignments in geometry and in geology. So they're saying, oh yeah, why would you move these stones that far? And it's probably to say, look, that's the direction you need to look at. Not only have we taken stones from this ley line in Wales, we've actually built another stone circle, which is the second largest in Britain, to create this alignment. So I think that this is what's happening.
I mean, do you know is it the Woolworth argument? I think it was put forward by Matt Parker, the Australian mathematician, who suggested that you could run a line anywhere through the British Isles and you'd be sure to hit a sacred site or two, or to hit like a couple of Woolworths as well. No matter where you run a line, you're sure to hit some kind of interesting site. And so this was intended to disprove the idea of alignments. But I think when you're running through really significant sites, like these three that you mentioned, for example, on this line, that's a different ball game altogether. You're not just saying, oh well, there's a stone here and there's a church there. These are significant sites.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard. I didn't know it was called the Woolworth Principle, but I've heard it raised by several people, and it's kind of I think it's a very dismissive, offhand comment, because they're not taking into account the significance of these sites. And I agree. I would broadly agree. You can just, if you say your only criteria is that these sites must be, ancient. So if we say they're like 2,000 or 3,000 years old or older, then yeah, you're going to be able to create any pattern you want. So this is the other thing that we should probably say about the sites on my grid, is they're either like the largest or second largest or most sacred, the man-made sites, at least, they're sort of the largest, second largest or man-made sites. So Chogga Zambil, I've not drawn the 56th on my Google Earth yet. I've still got it as 28th. I've not got around to that. But Chogga Zambil's on the grid.
Yes, I didn't know this site. So I saw the name when I was looking at your map. I don't know the site at all.
Yeah, it's a brilliant site because it's aligned north, south, east, west.
Oh, it looks like the footprint of a pyramid.
Yeah, but what's really important about it is the largest ziggurat in the world. So
right,
it's like, look at me, look how important I am. And again, it's really interestingly placed because it's 54 degrees from the Ricat structure.
Okay.
And I know we're going off on a bit of a tangent here, and it's like it's pretty close to being 54 degrees away from Akyum at the Angkor complex. And again, Akyum predates all of the Angkor complex. Technically, it's not even part of the Angkor complex. It was there first. It was later redeveloped. But it's the lake that was carved out right next to it. Even to this day, it's the largest hand-carved lake on the planet.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and for people that say you couldn't, hand carve out the rings of Atlantis, this is so much bigger than that.
Is it really?
It would just,
yeah.
Wow. I don't think it would have been a lot of fun. But
I think thinking about the engineering behind a site like that, or just even that rectangular lake, I mean, you can't underestimate the capabilities of people. Well, I don't know exactly when that particular lake was built, but I was going to say in the ancient world, that's quite general. But I mean, clearly they were capable of amazing things.
Yeah, I mean, that site is fairly modern. I think it's between like 800 and 1200 years old, depending on which part of it you're looking at.
Yeah.
But it's also marked out by the largest lake in Southeast Asia, which is Tonle Sap.
Okay.
So again, it's another massive feature. You keep, like Tiwanaku, isn't like the largest lake in South America or something like that.
Yeah, amazing.
But, yeah, it's there's reasons for these placements, as well as their size. If we go from Python's temple again, it creates an alignment, through the ziggurat of Ur down here, and Chogazambil, which is the largest ziggurat in the world, and it terminates in Shanghai, a very, very modern feature. So
I was going to ask you about modern features on this grid. So we have Shanghai.
Yes. Yeah.
Which of course could be also an ancient site.
It's really difficult to dig up information about some of these places in China. They often just say, oh, we know people have been in such and such a site since the Neolithic, and that's all you read.
Yeah. Well, this is a country where they plant trees on the mounds above old pyramids. They're not necessarily interested in preserving. I mean, I think every country around the world is guilty of that too. They kind of don't necessarily value these ancient monuments, ancient traces, but I would imagine it's very hard to find proof that Shanghai is ancient. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult. But basically, this alignment terminates at this man-made lake. This is only 22 years old. It's built on reclaimed land. This all used to be in the ocean 20, 30 years ago. But the alignment terminates here, and it goes straight through the canal that points to it as well.
That's very interesting. Right through the middle.
And you get like that building here is kind of like a gateway type building, and you see this even in Paris. You see buildings like this in Paris, modern buildings that set up alignments following sort of ancient geometry,
like La Défense in Paris.
Well, you get the Arc de Triomphe, don't you, which is quite modern.
That's great.
This is another meteor crater, and it's kind of tangential to this meteor crater. And there's another alignment that goes from this place in Shanghai, and it's tangential off the south face of the crater.
It also, that's a reminder that, Earth has been through a lot, bombarded like this by these meteors every so often. I mean, is it any wonder we've lost some knowledge?
Yeah, some of it's not even that long ago. I mean, this place is... I think the Tenema crater is quite recent. So I think it's like circa 30,000 years ago, something like that, or it could be much more recent. That's a huge impact for modern times anyway. I mean, this thing is, let's see how far it is across. This is quite recent. So it's nearly 2 kilometers across. This is an impact crater,
Matt, is it?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's like an ice age type impact. Certainly locally, people probably wouldn't have been in a very good way.
So there are very good reasons to believe that this grid was constructed, that it has sound geometric properties, that it's connected to the size of the Earth, to numbers that are important numbers like 56 and 144 and 28 and 7. But How does this connect, or does it connect in any way to the idea of ley lines and energy lines? Or Marshall just brought that up, in fact. This idea of dragon lines, I suppose this sense of earth energies. Do you think there's any connection to these kinds of ideas?
I think there's a number of ways to look at this, and you can take the kind of sort of speculative scientific approach. I'll mention that in a moment. You can take the sort of the idea that there were these sort of energy lines there in the first place. I'm not really qualified to speak about this. Or you think, you can look along the lines of somebody like Maria Wheatley, who says that when people walk a path enough, and enough people do it over enough eons, it then becomes like an energy line. And that's something, if somebody can prove that, I'm definitely open to it. I think it's something that needs to be explored. I think there are phenomena that we aren't fully aware of. We still haven't really figured out what consciousness is, and obviously AI is starting to bring that up again. So yeah, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know where it comes from and how it interacts with reality. There could be something to it. If you want to go from a materialist point of view, we know that there are mycelium networks, in the earth. And we're starting to learn now that fungi can communicate across long distances. And if a tree gets damaged by something, trees within the vicinity through the mycelium network will learn we need to put up our defenses now because something's happening. It could be that there's this superorganism within the earth that is conscious. It could even be biological. I hate to steal an idea from James Cameron's Avatar, but that's basically similar to his Avatar film. And who's to say it's restricted to the mycelium? There could be plankton in the sea that help communicate, and if it's going to be a line of communication, then it's going to be the shortest distance, which is the same as you get with the solar alignment. So there could be something going on from a more materialist perspective, but it could also be something going on in what we would consider a supernatural way. You get people that are talking about sort of earth currents as well that they think might be measurable. And I think that's an experiment that could be done to actually rule that out. I don't think anyone's really done that seriously in any critical way. You get people with like these generic broadband EM detectors, but you need to look at specific frequencies, and you need to look at conducted, versus I guess like radiated type measurements. And I think that would be a fairly simple experiment to do at certain sites, and it really might even be worth doing these experiments on different days of the year. So when the sun is at zenith, say over Tiwanaku, are we seeing an increase in current in the earth, at Avebury or something along those lines?
Or the moon or the planets, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. I used to know an A&E doctor. She wasn't some quack. She was a doctor in accident and emergency, and she was adamant that you get more crazy people on a full moon in A&E. She was absolutely adamant about that.
I hear policemen say the same.
Yeah, so there might be more to it, and it's something that because our society is we're starting from scratch with the scientific method. We've just relegated stuff that might have been common knowledge and just said, no, that's nonsense until we prove otherwise. And it might be the case that as time goes on, there might be certain ideas that there might be more to them than we first believed.
Well, I think that there's definitely something to these ideas. But having said that, when I look at your grid, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that because of the important numbers and the ratios, that it's the product of a mind or many minds as opposed to a completely natural feature, such as the Richat structure or Lake Manicouagan or that you mentioned in the beginning. This is something that's been created and constructed, and perhaps there is a link to these energies or perhaps not, but it looks like something that's precise and that's rational and that has a logic that you can understand, which is why it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would just on a little bit of a tangent. Years ago, I used to hand build like test boxes and machinery and bits and pieces, and I'd have to drill all the holes by hand. I don't think I could do it now, but I got to a point where I could precisely drill holes without having to measure where they were. And it could be that you may intuitively be able to do certain things with practice as long as you keep practicing.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's like you know a piece of music in your fingers from the piano or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if pigeons can navigate, I'd hope that humans can navigate. So,
if only it was as easy for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, really. I mean, I think these the placements of these sites, it's going to be very contentious, because if you look, I find it really difficult to argue with any of the sort of mainstream archaeologists about the datings of these sites. I think, there's so much evidence to say Giza is, 4,600 years old. There's like 500,000 tons of mortar in it, and every mortar sample taken tells you it's exactly that age when you carbon date it. And Tiwanaku is only something like 1,000 or 1,200 years old, and the Anchor complex is less than 1,000 years old. How does it relate to sites that are that old? So,
having said that, there is a tendency to fit the theory within the other theory, the paradigm, so that perhaps these are conservative estimates, and I know everyone knows about the controversy about the Sphinx, for example. The geologists have no problem accepting that the Sphinx is much older than what the Egyptologists say. So, which is an interesting dynamic in itself, So, I think absolutely we should take what the theories are seriously in terms of dating these sites, but we also have to remember that there's room for a little bit of pushback.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. But I think the argument that where I'm coming from is that I think these sites are all built on top of older things, and it might not just be, well, we've built over a mound. It could be a mound that was built into another mound and built into something, and then built into something else. You see this in Britain in particular, and other places. There's so many places in Britain that started out as a Neolithic settlement, and then it gets turned into a Bronze Age fort, and then it gets built over and turned into an Iron Age fort. And then it's largely sort of left alone by various other people until the Normans come along, and then the Normans start to build their Motte and Bailey castles on top of some of these places, and then you suddenly see churches. And so, how many iterations of this site have there been? And it kind of explains why so many of the capital cities in Europe, can be aligned using ley lines, for example. Cities and former capital cities seem to turn up a lot in ancient alignments.
That's so interesting. And actually, I know Marshall's been commenting here. She's been doing some work on London and London stone in particular. So it's so interesting. If anyone can have a look at Marshall's channel, I'll maybe put it in the description later. But that's the idea that these signs are there, and actually you just have to take a closer look, and it's not sometimes 100% proof, but sometimes you can see that there is some kind of evidence that leans towards this possibility that the site was much older than was given credit for previously. And that includes London, for example.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, London is definitely on a number of different alignments. If you go back to the Ice Age, London used to be a branch off of the same river that of the Seine in Paris. So there used to be a huge river that came through between, it's in the sort of English Channel now. It's all submerged, but there used to be a huge river that went out, between England and France to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Thames and the Seine were both branches of that. And, so people probably were going via boat to go between both places. I don't think that's particularly contentious to say. But I think Greenwich, what we use as the prime meridian today, I think there's a very important sort of Romano-Celtic temple there. So
at Greenwich, is there?
At Greenwich, yeah.
That's interesting. So that's right Park. On the prime meridian. So we go back to this idea of the grids.
Yeah, but it's something I've been trying to look at, because there are a bunch of sites around the world that are exactly at degree intervals away from Greenwich, and they're ancient sites. And you think, well, that's interesting. And
yes, because as we know, it's a bit like looking at the meter in the ancient world. It doesn't seem right to look at, our modern Greenwich meridian, prime meridian, in relation to the ancient world, when it could be that, well, we know that it could have been through Giza or Paris, or perhaps in India somewhere. There could have been other sort of prime meridians. So it's interesting to think that maybe Greenwich did have a role then.
I think it could have done. There's a temple dedicated to Jupiter at the site. So it's a Roman temple, but it's what they call Romano-Celtic. So they built Celtic features into it. So obviously the Romans were empire builders. They weren't just going to wipe people out. They wanted to take over and subjugate you. And so it's a Roman temple, but it's built in a Celtic style. So it's got a circumambulatory around it. And circumambulation is an ancient tradition you find all throughout the old world, from Britain to the Middle East to India. And people circumambulate a site, and most recognizable to people today would be the Hajj that people go on at Mecca. People circumambulate that site.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
they circumambulate 7 times anti-clockwise. And that site is home to a stone that was said to have been egg-shaped, before it was smashed and reconstructed.
Oh, interesting.
So,
and a meteorite as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and people circumambulate lingams and things that are similar to lingams, and it's like, well, is it some way? Is it some Chinese whispers of lost knowledge, or is it a secret way to encode knowledge into those who know how to read it? And it's interesting that the people that follow Islam, they face Mecca when they pray. It's almost, trying to preserve at least some element of sort of geodetic knowledge into the followers of Islam. So they have to be able to find the direction of Mecca. And Mecca is the zenith node of a number of different alignments.
Wow, that's when you think of it like that, that's amazing. No. Do you want to show anything else on your Google Earth or on your map before we finish up, Matt?
Oh, I really do, because I'm going to go off the deep end here.
Oh, just before we go away from Britain, Marshall was saying about Watling Street. That's an interesting alignment. Running through Greenwich Park. That's interesting, and through London more generally. So so what have you got to?
Is it this one here? Is it, or something?
Yeah. So it's basically, it goes all up and down the country. It's not the same as your alignment that you showed with Stonehenge and Avebury, but it's an old, I suppose, trackway road.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very close to McLeod Stone. Yeah, it terminates around here somewhere, doesn't it? 331.39, I made it.
I actually don't know, but yeah, it could be.
Oh, Castle Rig. That's pretty close as well.
Uh-huh.
Castle Rig's interesting. I think it's another half interval. So if you divide, or if instead of 56, if we said there were like 112 intervals, I think Castle Rig falls in that system. And Castle Rig is part of various alignments. I think there's an alignment to the Derry Kagan stone through Castle Rig that goes somewhere else. We could talk about that another time.
Off the top of my head, I think it's on the same latitude as Mar City and Mecca, and then is it Thornborough Henge? I may be wrong. I'm just remembering.
Hold on, where does that go? It's pretty close to Paris, isn't it? That's interesting. Yeah, this is why it's good to get comments from people, because I learn stuff all the time.
Yeah, the comments are fantastic. I'm really glad we put them up. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, this is the one I'm most interested in. So Denisovan Cave.
I haven't asked you about the Denisovans.
It's important. Yeah, the Denisovan Cave is, the entrance to the cave is 114 meters off of the grid line, the 56th grid, and it's what, 3.5 kilometers off of the Avebury latitude or Lake Manicouagan latitude.
Yeah,
it's really, I think it's there on purpose.
and that would obviously push the date back quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, kind of inspired by Andrew Collins, I think that the Denisovans might be more important than we think at the moment, because we still know very little about them from a biological context, although saying that we've recently found out that Homo longi is actually Denisovan. So we know what their skull shape looks like now. And they have the longest skull of any human species. They had, from that one sample, their brain size is on the upper edge of what we have as Homo sapiens.
Do you mean long, as in like Akhenaten with his, like Tutankhamun, that kind of long? Is that what you mean? Or
it's long front to back. So in the way, well, if you look at Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, we all came from a species called Homo heidelbergensis. I think that's the one. And all three of our species, we came from that common ancestor, but all three of us have separately grown larger brains. And it seems for Homo sapiens, our skulls have grown upwards to get that extra volume. And it looks like the Denisovans, theirs have gone backwards to get that extra volume. So that their skulls aren't particularly tall, but they are particularly long. And it makes you wonder, if you were a hybrid between a Denisovan and a Homo sapien, would it go sort of up and back? That might be something worth looking into. But I don't think it's like the same shape as like, those Egyptian pharaohs and the skulls that you see in places like Peru. I don't know, maybe I can bring up a picture. I don't know. No, I don't know how to share my web browser. I think it's gonna get upset if I share my web browser.
Oh, don't worry about it. It's fine.
But the Denisovans, or the Homo longi, whatever you want to call them at this point, because I think there's going to be some argument about that in the next few years. They were ahead of us. I don't mean now, but in the Stone Age, they were so far ahead of us technologically. It doesn't look like they were doing any kind of agriculture, probably because they didn't have the numbers to justify it. They lived in very small family groups, so hunter-gathering would have been fine for them. But they were basically in the Neolithic at least sort of 30,000 years ahead of us, and possibly maybe even 70,000 years ahead of us. So they were grinding and drilling and rasping stone and sort of precious stones as well, and creating what we would recognize today as Euclidean geometric shapes. This was not something our species wasn't capable of until the last 10 to 12,000 years.
Or so we've been told.
Yeah, so we've been told, yeah. I mean, my argument against that is that there might have been shared knowledge, but I kind of think that the Denisovans, because they were a mountain people, they were specially adapted to the mountains, and the gods always lived in the mountains. I think possibly they may have been the sort of gods that we talk about in ancient books, and obviously, again, Chinese whispers over time have turned them into things that they weren't, but their knowledge might have seemed almost magical. And it might have been these people that pioneered this ancient grid system, and maybe they were the original mound builders before we came along much later and built temples over them.
Absolutely. Could be.
But there's if you look at the sort of there's a sort of a field of academia called phylogenetics, and they're often they're often bashing heads with archaeologists because they're looking at sort of genetic evidence and sort of phylology and putting these two disciplines together, and often disagreeing with what we get told by historians and archaeologists. And I think the sort of consensus almost from phylogenetics is that all of the world's creation stories that can be found, in religions from like Peru to North America to Japan to Egypt, ancient Britain, everywhere, they almost certainly have a common origin, according to phylogenetics, that dates back to about 130,000 years ago, which is, before this interglacial, which happened sort of 10, 12,000 years ago. That was the last time Lake Manicouagan was ice-free, and it's so important to my world grid.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many things that date back to this 130,000 years period. You got the Cerruti Mastodon site in the Americas. That was seemingly debunked, but now it's been rebunked. People have re-examined the evidence, and they think that people might have been, they don't know who and what species, but there might have been people in the Americas 130,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Would you say your system would still survive if Lake Manicouagan didn't exist? How important is it to the system? Because in a sense, there's no single site that's more important than the system, or would you disagree with that?
I think, well, it serves as my primary meridian, and it might just be because of how, I interpret things in my modern mindset, but because it's that 1 radian distance from the Rickard structure, it's very important, because the whole system is derived from radians. But I also think that's kind of why Tiwanaku, or some ancestor site to Tiwanaku, was placed, so that when the ice does come back, you still have a reference for this system. And I think that's also why you get this imagery encoded onto the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku, where you have 3 rows of 16 people kneeling next to this godlike figure in the middle that might not actually be a god, but a teacher.
The guy
he's holding. It looks like he's holding like a spear in one hand and an atlatl in the other hand, and it could be that he's teaching people how to navigate and measure using the sun and spears and atlatls, using simple tools and geometry. But it's the 3 rows of 16, because the distance between Tiwanaku and the Rickard structure is 3/16 of the Earth's circumference. And it's that same distance to Lake Manicouagan. I think that site, or it may be an ancestor site that used to exist there, was placed just to reinforce the importance of Lake Manicouagan, because that will be covered up for most of time, as if you're in the Quaternary, which we are in now.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I think you've done amazing work, Matt.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, there's a lot to think about, and I think it would be very, very difficult to dismiss this out of hand. There's so much there. There's so much intricacy. There's logic. There are these important numbers that you talked about, and it's not just any old site. It's not just Woolworths.
Yes. Exactly.
It's these key sites, whether they're natural or not, but they're these really, really key sites, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Fantastic work. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
What's next in your research? What's the next step?
Really, for me, I'm trying to compile all of this. I've been talking about writing a book for ages, and I'm slowly doing that. It's a number of years away. I've got so much going on at the moment. But yeah. I want to compile a book, which is I want to come out with a handheld guide to what I consider prehistoric navigation. So if you get my book, you should be able to get a sundial and a spear, and if you're up to it, you could create some omphalos stones, and you should be able to do what these people were doing in the ancient world.
Does it come with a manual on how to build a reed boat?
I think maybe somebody else would be a better person to do it. I don't want to be liable for anyone dying in the ocean on a reed boat. Not in this day and age of litigation.
Thank you so much. I think
thank you.
That sounds fantastic. I really hope you get to do that. Now, I know you're busy, you have work, you have your life, you have your house to look after and all the rest of it, but just keep it up, because this is really fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Melissa. So I think obviously the stuff that you're coming up with now is with your own research is very interesting, because there are places on my grid where I can explain either the latitude or the longitude, but I can't always explain both. And some of these sites you've been looking at, and it looks like you're getting these integer sort of forms being set up through solstice and equinox alignments, don't you? So that could be very important to what I'm looking at as well. So
it's just what I feel. It's just a question of trying something out, trying an idea out. Maybe there's something in it, maybe there isn't. But just if you don't know, you just have another go and just keep trying. You know, seek and you shall find.
Brilliant. It's been great talking to you, Melissa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt. Everybody have a look at Matt's channel. Actually, there's a link there to his channel, and most of the videos so far, Matt, have been on your work on Atlantis, which is really interesting. And then this is taking, I suppose, a step back from the single site and looking at the broader picture of the world grid that you've come across. So please have a look at Matt's work. It's really fantastic. So thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. Bye, everyone. And thanks for the comments, everyone.